Okay, welcome back. We are ready for maths now, our second session of the day. And as in literacy, it's the start of a new half term, so it's the start of a new unit in maths as well. You'll remember we have finished our most recent unit, which was on statistics. We also did our couple of days of sort of revision as well. And we're starting today on measurement. Now, I'd like you actually just to pause the video in a moment and just think and have a chat at home about what you understand that to mean. What do you think we mean by measurement? What could that involve in maths? What type of things do you think we'll be doing? So pause the video here, have a conversation about that and click on when you're ready. Okay, so we're going to begin with our cold task then. And for this, just a reminder that for our cold task, it's about seeing what you can already do. So it might be that you whiz through this without problem, in which case that will kind of indicate that, yeah, you're really confident with measurement. It might actually be that some of this you find really tricky. Either of those things is okay. But what this is about showing is so that you kind of understand for yourself and people at home understand as well how you are getting on with measurement and what kind of stage you are at with it. When we're all at school, we use a cold task so that as a teacher, I can sort of see who's where and who is maybe in need of a bit of help or who might need a bit of pushing on a bit further. That's why we do these cold tasks. So hopefully it will be kind of useful for you at home as well, and you can kind of get a sense of where you're at. But what we'll also do is then after you've done your cold task questions, I'll give a bit of an introduction for this unit, and then we'll go back over some of the answers as well. So hopefully stick with the whole video and see how you get on. But first of all, I'm going to give you these cold task questions. So with each of these, pause the video on each one, maybe sort of do some jotting down if you want to, and see how you get on. So question number one then, it says, measure the length of the device you're using. So that might be your laptop, your phone, your tablet. I want you to measure it and find out how long it is. Now, conversation number one at home is going to be, what could you use to measure it? So have a good think about that as well. So that's question number one. Pause that and come back when you're ready. Here's question number two. I'd like you to have a go at ordering these lengths. So I'm going to say there, sorry. Order these lengths from smallest to largest. So you've got 5 centimeters, 40 millimeters, and 3 meters. Have a chat about that. Try to order those from smallest to largest. Okay, hope you're ready then for question 3. This one says, Dexter measures his toy car and says, my car is around 6.5 centimeters long. Have a look at that ruler. Do you agree? Explain why, or maybe why not. So have a good look. Dexter's saying his toy car there is 6.5 centimeters long. Do you agree with him? Have a conversation about that at home and then come back when you're ready for the next question. Okay. Which of these objects would you measure in meters and why? So some of these objects you might want to measure in meters, others you might use a different measurement. You'll have a conversation about what those different measurements could be. And have that conversation at home and then come back when you're ready. Marley says, I can't measure the length of my living room because my meter stick isn't long enough. So I've got a picture of a girl here with a meter stick. This is something we have in school. I appreciate you're unlikely to have one at home, but a meter stick is a meter long. And Marley says, I can't measure the length of my living room because my meter stick isn't long enough. Can you have a think about how she could actually use her meter stick to do it? Is there a way of doing it, do you think? So have that conversation at home and then come back when you are ready. Yeah, last one. Can you have a good think about what the length all the way around the outside of this rectangle would be? Might need to do a bit of adding up for that. Can you have a think about what the length all the way around the outside of this rectangle would be? Okay, thank you. So let's have a bit of a conversation. I'm going to come back to the answers at the end of the video and I'll sort of talk through some of those things then. But let's firstly just actually start at the very beginning and have a think what we mean by measurement. I'm sure that cold task will have sort of given you a few hints and clues already. We're talking about, though, how we can measure particular things. And in terms of what you've done already in school, that will relate to the length of things, or you might say the size of things. So we might measure things in meters. That's a very long measurement. Meters we would use for very large objects. If you were going to measure the length of your house, maybe, I'm sure you would measure that in meters. If you were going to measure the height of a building, meters. If you're going to measure the length of a car, that would probably be meters as well. A meter is 100 centimeters. So centimeters are much smaller. A centimeter is very, very small indeed. We're talking about the sort of distance between my fingers there. A centimeter, very, very small unit of measurement. And so we would probably use centimeters when talking about fairly small things. So maybe if you were going to measure the length of your phone, that might be centimeters. If you're going to measure the length of a pencil, you'd probably do that in centimeters. They're quite small things. Now, millimeters are even smaller still. So millimeters are absolutely really, really, really tiny. I'll zoom right in. Millimeters are very, very, very small. Tiny, tiny things. And so when we're talking about millimeters, we'd really only use that when we're talking about very, very tiny objects. Maybe a grain of rice we might well measure in millimeters if we're being really, really accurate. So we've got different units of length there, different units of measurement that we can use to measure length. But really, it's there. We could measure with all of these things, but we would probably go for the one that's most appropriate. So if it's a large object, probably meters. If it's a smaller object, centimeters. If it's really, really tiny, we might go for millimeters. So we've talked about, I've sort of mentioned some of this briefly then. What unit of measurement would you use to measure these different objects? So let's think about, first of all, about meters. That's the largest one. Which of these would you go for meters? Probably the height of a house, that would be good. What about centimeters? So they're a little bit smaller. Which of these could you usefully measure in centimeters? I'd say definitely the pencil. And then these final two, the sharpener or the fingernail, I'd say we could measure those in centimeters, possibly millimeters though, if we were looking to be really accurate. A millimeter is a far smaller unit of measurement, so a millimeter might be more useful for certainly a fingernail, I would say, and possibly a sharpener as well. So let's look then at how we can actually measure things. So I'm sure when you began your discussion on this, I bet lots of you mentioned the idea of a ruler, because this is something we have used in school before. I have to say you're probably most familiar using a ruler to underline things and use a ruler to draw a straight line, which is obviously one really good use of them. But another really important use of a ruler is being able to measure things. And I wonder if, maybe mum or dad's toolbox at home, you might well have a tape measure, you might well have that kind of thing. So maybe if you don't have a ruler, you might well have kind of measure that you would use, maybe if it's in for sort of building or something, you might have one in the toolbox at home. So if you haven't got a ruler to hand, maybe have a hunt for one of those at home. That would be really handy for you. Let's look at how we can measure them. I'll do this in a bit more detail in a couple of pages, but when we are using a ruler, we'll always put the object or line that up with the 0. That means that we're going to start our measurement at 0. And if we then lie that object straight on the line, and then we can see how high up it goes. Now I can count on here from 0 to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That pencil is in line with the 7, isn't it? So if that was centimeters, that would be 7 centimeters. Sometimes it's a little bit trickier and our object might fall in between two numbers on our ruler. So this one's falling between 4 and 5. Now, if you think back to when you were in year R, people probably told you, there are no numbers between 4 and 5. It goes 4 and then 5. But of course, actually, there's loads, isn't there? There's, in many ways, an infinite number of numbers between 4 and 5. There's loads and loads of tiny little numbers between 4 and 5. We might say 4.5. 4.5 is a number that's between 4 and 5. So we could call that 4.5 centimeters. If we were being really, really accurate, we might start talking about it as a decimal. We might say 4.5 centimeters. Now, that's not something we spent too much time talking about really this year, but I guess one or two of you might already be thinking about that. And you can see this bottom one here as well. We've lined it up with 0. It goes up to 10. So that's pretty much spot on 10 centimeters, isn't it? Now, could we accurately measure these pencils at the moment? What do you think? Well, I would say it's not ideal, is it? It's not how I would measure these pencils. What would I do differently? I'd make sure they all started on 0 because that would make my life much, much easier. But is it still possible to do? Well, yes, we could. It's not ideal. It's not the best way of doing it. But we can see, for example, that this pencil goes from 3 centimeters to 10 centimeters. And we could count up. I could go from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Or I could do a bit of subtracting. I could do 10 take away 3 is 7. Or I could count on from 3 to 10. I know that's 7. So all in all here, we can still see that that's 7, even though it's not particularly clearly laid out. This one likewise goes from 9 to 14. So how long is that pencil then if it goes from 9 to 14? It's 5 centimeters long, isn't it? And this one goes from 5 centimeters to 15. So that one is, that's right, it's 10 centimeters long. Okay, let me show you then how we can use our rulers, and we can try to be really, really accurate with this. So here is my ruler. Oh yeah, I think that's looking about the right size for me. Fantastic. So a couple of top tips then. I know first of all, I'm going to need to kind of line up my ruler with the object. So I'm going to start off making sure that my ruler starts at 0. Sorry, the object starts at the 0 on my ruler. Fantastic. I'm really pleased with that. Now, can I measure this red line at the moment? I would say no, actually, because right now I haven't got it lined up really neatly. So I would, oh, that's not very helpful, is it? I'm going to line up my ruler. There we go. That's a bit better, isn't it? So now I've got that in line nicely. And I've lined up with 0, and now this is going to be quite easy for me to read. I can see that's going from 0 to 18, so that's 18 centimeters. Let me have a go at my green line now. So same again, I'm going to line up the edge of my line here with the 0. I'm going to swing my ruler around, make sure it's all nicely lined up. Now let's see, it's going from 0 to, oh, that one's right between 11 and 12. What would you call that one? What do you reckon? How long is that green line? We know it's more than 11 centimeters, but it's not yet 12 centimeters. So I think we can call that 11.5 centimeters roughly. Now you might be wondering, hang on a minute, Mr. Vass, your ruler actually has some numbers on the other side, doesn't it? Let's have a look. So it does, yeah. And chances are your ruler at home will also have 2 sides like this. Now you've got to be really careful, because if I were to spin this one round, that doesn't mean that this is nearly 3 centimeters long. Very often our rulers will have 2 sides, and that's to help us to do 2 measurements. Now, usually in our country, we'll have centimeters on one side, and the other one very often is a slightly older measurement called inches. Now, certainly for us in the national curriculum for schools, we only need to really think about centimeters. Inches is a bit of an old-fashioned one. It's not used so often now, so centimeters is definitely most useful for us. But just be aware that your ruler might well have 2 sorts of measures on it. Now, how do you know which is which? The short answer is you look at your ruler, and very often it will have something like a cm on it, and that will stand for centimeter. So if you find the side that says cm, you know you're going to be on the right side. And how long is this blue line then? It goes from 0 to 7, so it's 7 centimeters. Okay, let's have a good think then about some of these cold task questions. So some of these you might have found really easy, some of them you might have found quite tricky. Either way, that's completely fine. Your cold task is just about you exploring a little bit, finding out how much you know already, how much you can do already. Some of these would have been quite simple, some of them a bit trickier. Either answer is fine, don't worry. So this one obviously will be quite unique to you, depends what you were measuring, but hopefully you got on okay with that. If you didn't know how to do that, maybe you can do it now that we've looked at how to use a ruler. Now this was an interesting one, wasn't it? Order these lengths from smallest to largest. I wonder how many of you did that and went, well, it's 3 and then 5 and then 40. it wouldn't have been a silly thing to do at all, because obviously you've ordered those numbers correctly. But we're not comparing like for like here, because even though 5 is bigger than 3, meters are much bigger than centimeters. So it wasn't actually the case that 5 centimeters is bigger than 3 meters. You might remember that our order of smallest to largest measure was it went millimeters was the smallest thing, centimeters was the middle of the 3, and meters was the largest. And even then, though, it doesn't necessarily mean it would come in this order. We need to think really carefully about some conversion. Now, we will actually go into a lot more detail about this in a lesson coming up, but for now, 40 millimeters was the smallest. That's the same as 4 centimeters. 5 centimeters was next, and 3 meters was the largest. So Dexter measured his toy car and said, "My toy car is around 6.5 centimeters long. Do you agree with him?" So with this, the end of his car did go up to about 6.5 centimeters long. If I draw a little, I was about to say imaginary line, it's not imaginary now, I'm drawing it. If I draw a line down there, it does go to pretty much 6.5. But why is his car not 6.5 centimeters long? Well, it didn't start at 0, it started at 1. And so really that's looking more like 5.5 centimeters long. If you were being really picky, you might have said, well, we don't actually know whether that ruler is measuring centimeters or millimeters or inches. Very good point if you did mention that. Maybe this is measuring inches, for example. That would be another good point you could have mentioned. So which of these objects would you have measured in meters? Well, meters is not the largest, but it's the largest of the 3 we've mentioned today, and it's a measurement we'd use to measure larger objects. So I would say in this case, the tree, probably a good thing to measure in meters. The elephant, the house, definitely a good idea. Probably not any of the others. If we were measuring, for example, that key ring in meters, chances are we'd need to write something like 0.03 meters, and that wouldn't be very helpful. So yeah, we'd far more likely measure that in centimeters, for example. Marley said, "I can't measure the length of my living room because my meter stick isn't long enough." Well, were there some different ways she could have done it? Yes. One way she could have done it is she could have used that meter stick and a little marker to measure multiple lengths of the meter stick. So she could have put the meter stick down and then maybe put down a pencil or even made a little mark on the carpet if mum and dad didn't mind, and then continued measuring on from there. So she could measure out 1 meter, put a marker, and then use that meter stick again, and then measure the next bit, and put down a little marker, and keep counting up as she went. That would have been one way you could have done it. Maybe if you've got a ruler or something at home, maybe you could measure your own living room today. That would be a really good thing to do next. Maybe you could measure the height of your bedroom, or you could measure how long your bath is. That would be a really good activity to practice today. Maybe you could use your ruler or your measuring tape, whatever you happen to have to hand at home. I'll even put in the description, I'll put a link to how you can print out a ruler as well. So if you really don't have anything to measure with at home, but you do have a printer, you could use that as well. You might find there are a couple of good sites where you can get a kind of measuring app on your phone as well, but that gets a bit tricky. So I'll leave you to find that if you need it. Okay, thanks everyone. Well done for this sort of first lesson on measures. Hopefully that's got you thinking. I'll see you back for our last video lesson of the day, which is spellings.